A scream cut through the snow that morning, sharp, then swallowed by the silence. No one opened their doors. No one asked who it belonged to. In this season, suffering had become private. And grief, too ordinary to chase. The forest waited just beyond the fields, a jagged wall of limbs and shadows. Between the trees, the wind whispered in forgotten tongues. It carried with it the scent of rot and frost-bitten bark, ancient, bitter things. The woman tightened her cloak. Her boots, cracked and softened from years of wear, barely held together. She stepped into the whiteness without ceremony. The child had not stirred when she left. His breath came in shallow clouds, and she left him a coal and a promise. She would not return empty-handed. Every step into the snow was a choice. Forward, into the unknown. Or back, into slow starvation. The woods knew what she was. Desperate. And the woods had never been kind to the desperate. Above her, the crows shifted on their perch, feathers puffed and gleaming black against the gray. They did not call. Just watched. Still. Like sentinels who had seen this story unfold 1,000 winters before. The forest floor cracked and sighed beneath her feet. Ice snapped in the joints of fallen branches, and her breath caught in her throat as if the trees might wake. Her fingers, stiff with cold, reached into a satchel, empty save for a rusted hook and a string of prayer beads her mother once wore when the rains failed. She no longer prayed. Hunger had stripped faith to the bone. She moved deeper. The sun, such as it was, dimmed behind a pale veil of clouds. Time no longer passed in hours, only in steps. Her legs ached. Her belly groaned. Once, she thought she heard a flute. Just one note, far off. But when she turned, the forest was still. Then she saw it. A hare. Thin, trembling. It hadn't seen her. It was digging beneath a patch of brush, unaware of the predator nearby. She reached for the hook, slow, deliberate, every breath a prayer to silence. But the wind shifted. The hare turned. Gone in a blink, into the trees. She fell to her knees where it had been, the snow wet through her skirts, her hands buried in the dirt the creature had scraped away. And there, beneath root and stone, a root. Thick. Twisted. A piece of burdock or wild turnip. She clawed at it with her nails, ignoring the pain, the sting of skin tearing. The root broke loose. She wept as she held it. Not for joy. For the shame of it. That this was what triumph had become. She stood, knees shaking, and turned to leave, but the world had changed behind her. The path was gone. Snow had covered her footprints. The woods, familiar in morning light, now felt endless, like the belly of something too large to comprehend. She walked. Eyes squinting through white. Breath shallow. Her teeth chattered in rhythm with her steps. The wind picked up. Not a storm, just a sharp warning. And then, from between the trees, figures. She stopped. They stood motionless. 3 of them. Cloaked in skins and silence. Their faces masked with ash, or perhaps hunger. One held a staff. Another, nothing. The third carried a bundle in his arms, a child, unmoving, wrapped in torn wool. They said nothing. Only watched. She did not move. She knew better than to plead. The tallest among them stepped forward and placed something in the snow between them. A pouch. Then turned, and vanished into the trees with the others, as silently as they had come. She waited. Minutes passed. Or hours. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. The pouch held dried meat, venison, or something close. Her hands shook as she pulled the string tight again and tucked it deep into her cloak. She did not look back. By the time the forest began to thin, dusk had fallen. The snow glowed in strange hues, blue, then violet, then gray. The steeple appeared on the horizon, crooked, haloed in crows. She felt her knees weaken. Smoke. Not thick, just a thread rising from a chimney that should not burn. Her heart raced. She ran. Tripped. Crawled the last few steps to her door. It hung open. Inside, cold. The child lay in the ashes. But he stirred. She dropped everything. Pulled him to her chest. He was alive. Barely. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they saw her. She built the fire again. Fed it twigs. Then the root. Then the meat. The smell filled the hut like incense. Her hands blistered from the heat, but she didn't care. She fed the child first. Slow. Careful. His lips moved. He swallowed. Outside, the village held its breath. Someone lit a torch at the chapel. And for the first time in weeks, the bell groaned. Not a ring. Just a low metal sigh. She closed her eyes. Not in rest. In resistance. Spring was far. Hope was fragile. But they had survived this day. And outside, in the woods, a crow took flight. Far to the north, clouds gathered again. And somewhere beyond the trees, someone watched. Someone who remembered warmth. And fire. And war. The wind moved like a spirit through the broken arches of the monastery, dragging with it the dead breath of winter. It sighed through the hollow cloisters and pressed against the rose window where glass once danced with color. Now the window was awound, shattered, skeletal, rimmed with frost, and snow fell through it in slow spirals, dusting the stones where once monks had knelt in prayer. Their voices, once lifted in sacred harmony, had been buried beneath silence. Brother Aidan sat alone in the far corner of the cloister, his back to the wind, his knees drawn close. A single candle wept beside him, its flame weak, flickering. Its wax had run down the sides in slow agony, hardened in shapes that looked like ribs. He had no ink, no quill. Only a psalm remembered from before the hunger. He scratched it into the surface of a cracked bench, using ash and the edge of his nail. Each letter carved from memory, each word a defiance. He was 21, though he looked older now. Starvation hollowed the body faster than time. His robes, once deep brown and heavy, now hung like old curtains, faded, thinned by wear, patchworked with threadbare cloth. Beneath them, his bones were sharp, his hands yellow with cold. He could no longer feel the ends of his fingers. The last boy who could still sing had died that morning. Brother Cuthbert. 17. He had been found curled against the apse wall, lips blue, hands folded over his ribs as if in final prayer. They buried him in the garden, beneath the snow that had once been violets. No chance. Just hands, trembling, pushing earth with wooden spoons and broken slates. Aidan had watched from a distance. There was no warmth left for morning. Only the ache of survival. He remembered the spring, how foolish it seemed now, to have knelt in the herb garden with joy in his chest, to have whispered vows among thyme and lilac as bells rang overhead. He had been eager then, full of fire and faith. Now, that same bell hung limp above them, the rope stiff with frost, its voice silent. The tower itself leaned slightly, as if ashamed. In the refectory, the bowls sat unused. No one had eaten in days. What roots remained were stored in a locked cabinet. The prior had the key. But the prior had not spoken since the snows came. He wandered the halls in silence now, pausing at doorways, sometimes murmuring in Latin, though the words were strange, twisted with dread. Aidan feared him more than the hunger. They no longer gathered for matins. The chapel was colder than the world outside. The stained glass saints had gone black with soot. The virgin's eyes, once gentle, now stared out through cracked panes like a warning. Aidan kept to the cloister. He read the air by its silence, by the way snow fell through the broken roof, by the angle of the frost on the inner wall. He marked the hours by the fading of his candle. Light had become his liturgy. Each night brought dreams. Feasts, roasted meats, sweet melons, dripping honey. He could feel the juice on his fingers. His mother's voice sang from the edge of memory. His father's laugh, calling in the cattle from pasture. Then waking. Cold. Stomach in knots. A tongue dry as parchment. He began to wonder if sin and starvation were siblings. If craving warmth was vanity. If dreaming of meat made him gluttonous. If wanting to live meant he had failed his vow. In the dark, temptation was louder than God. He tried to write scripture. But the verses blurred. His Latin slipped. Some nights he made up lines and wrote them anyway, just to hear his own voice in his skull. On the fourth night of the deepest snow, he heard a knock at the monastery gate. Not loud. Not urgent. 3 knocks, soft as breath. He froze. No one had come in weeks. He listened. Silence. Then, again, 3 knocks. No one else moved. He waited. A full hour. Then another. The candle was nearly dead. He rose, joints stiff, heart sluggish, and walked the long corridor to the gate, each footstep echoing like a drumbeat in a tomb. The gate was rimmed in iron, frostbitten. He touched it, and the cold burned. He opened the window. There, in the snow, stood a girl. She was perhaps 12. Wrapped in ragged furs, a cloth pulled over her mouth. Her hair was white with snow. In her arms, a bundle. She did not speak. He stared at her, too stunned for words. She raised the bundle. Laid it on the stone. Then turned. Walked into the white. He opened the door and reached out. Inside the bundle, bread. Coarse. Dense. Black at the edges. But bread. He wept. Not for himself. For the mystery of it. He took it inside, broke it carefully. Gave half to the brother closest to death. Left a piece at every cell. Left none for himself. But that night, the candle did not flicker. That night, he finished the psalm. The last line, "Thou preparest a table before me." He wrote it in ash, fingers trembling, onto the stone floor. When the candle finally died, the darkness no longer frightened him. Somewhere, beyond the cloister, a child had carried bread through the blizzard. And in that act, the world whispered, "Not yet. Not yet." Spring was still a myth. But faith had teeth again. And outside, in the rose window, snow kept falling, quiet, slow, endless. But the wind carried a new sound. Not morning. A breath. A stirring. The faint memory of bells. The fountain stood still, arrested mid-breath, as if the town itself had forgotten how to exhale. Ice curled from its lip in glassy fingers, locking time in place. Where once children had splashed and traders had quarreled, only silence remained, thick, stubborn, and absolute. The snow that blanketed the square was not clean. It covered broken things. Bones. Spilled soot. Crushed fruit that had rotted before the frost ever came. The market stalls, with their slanted roofs and sagging canvas, hunched like old men. Empty. Frozen. Waiting for nothing. And in the midst of it all, she walked. Her name was Ellen. Just 14, though the winter had taken years from her already. Her face had the shape of hunger, sunken cheeks, pale lips cracked with cold. Her breath came out in clouds, curling around the rag doll clutched in her red, trembling hand. Brita. Named for the sister whose body had been buried before the frost hardened the ground too deeply to dig. Breda, whose laugh had once rung through the square louder than the bell tower. Breda, whose hair this doll wore in scraps of wool, whose eyes had been copied in coal. Ellen moved like smoke, slipping between the ruined stalls, her steps careful but without purpose. The rags around her feet were soaked through, black where they touched snow. Her coat, once her mother's, hung from her shoulders like an ill-fitting memory. She did not beg. There was no one left to ask. Kindness had dried up faster than the apples last harvest. Once, this square had smelled of spices, bread, sweat, and laughter. Now, it reeked of cold iron and old blood. Her father had died a month ago. The fevers had come quick, first the shivers, then the cough, then the black around the lips. She had watched him breathe his last by candle smoke in a prayer neither of them believed. Her mother still lived, though barely, coughing in the dark corner of their hut, wrapped in the same blanket since autumn. They had no wood. No meat. Just a bowl of hardened grease they used for light. Each night, Ellen kept vigil. She sat by the dying flame and whispered to Breda, telling her stories their mother once told, of beasts beneath the hills and saints in golden robes. She imagined Breda responding, nodding solemnly, laughing when she was supposed to. It didn't matter that the voice came from her own throat. Loneliness needed an echo. The townsfolk had changed. Eyes turned inward. Words were few, and always sharp. The cobbler had thrown a rock at her when she wandered near his porch. The butcher's wife, who once gave her sugared plums, now barred her windows when Ellen passed. No one had bread. Or if they did, they would rather die than share it. Hunger had rewritten the commandments. But still, each morning, she came. To the square. To the fountain. As if ritual could bend the world back to what it once was. She would brush the snow from the stone ledge, place Breda there like a relic, and sit beside her. Waiting. Not for rescue. Rescue was a story from other places. She waited for something quieter, an end, or a sign. Whichever came first. Today, the cold felt sharper. As if the air itself had grown teeth. Her fingers could no longer uncurl. She wrapped them in her skirts, pressing Breda close to her chest. Her eyes scanned the windows above the stalls, where shutters hung like broken lids. She counted the chimneys without smoke. Too many. Far too many. A cart passed once, drawn by a donkey with ribs like a harp. A man walked behind it, face wrapped in linen, eyes sunken deep. He did not see her. Or he pretended not to. That was the new way. To look too long was to risk remembering your own child. Your own hunger. She tried to hum a lullaby, but her throat was dry. Only wind answered, curling around the fountain, stirring the snow in gentle spirals. Her breath was shallow. She laid Breda in her lap and leaned back, the stone cold against her spine. Above, the bell tower groaned. She looked up. A sliver of movement. Just a shadow. Or perhaps a trick of the light. Her heart lifted, barely, like a bird testing its wings. But the bell did not ring. Not yet. She closed her eyes. Let the snow fall on her lashes. And in the dark behind her eyelids, she imagined spring. She saw Breda running through the square barefoot, laughing, face turned to the sun. She saw her mother baking bread, hair braided, cheeks flushed with warmth. Her father chopping wood, whistling. The fountain bubbling, the stalls bursting with color, the bell ringing high and clear. And in her lap, Breda stirred. She knew it wasn't real. But she smiled anyway. Because for a moment, the snow felt less cruel. Then, footsteps. Real. Slow. Coming across the square. She opened her eyes. A boy, perhaps 16, wrapped in a cloak too fine for this place. He held something in his hands. A bundle. He approached her with caution, as if she might vanish. He knelt. Offered her the bundle. Bread. 2 pieces. Coarse. Dense. Still warm. She stared. Blinked. Take it, he said, his voice like ash and ember. It's all I have. She reached out. Their fingers touched. And for the first time in weeks, she felt warmth not from fire, but from skin. She took the bread, placed 1 piece in her pocket, and broke the other in half. Offered him a share. He shook his head. I've already eaten. A lie, but a kind one. They sat in silence, side by side on the edge of the frozen fountain. Breda between them. The bell tower above. The snow falling steady. And for that hour, the world breathed. When he left, he did not speak again. Just nodded. Disappeared into the alleys. She stayed. Held the last piece of bread in her hands. Not for herself. For her mother. She would bring it home. And tonight, the candle would not be grease. Tonight, there would be light. And from light, perhaps something more. Not hope. But something just beneath it. Something like memory waking. The scream never echoed. It clung to the stones, swallowed before it could rise. Somewhere beneath the flagstones, the kitchen boy's blood still steamed, mingling with the grease of long-dead feasts. The rats had come bold this time. Not shadows. Not thieves. But sovereigns, sharp-toothed, quick-eyed, unafraid. They'd watched the boy stumble, feverish and thin, his hands clutching a cracked bowl of marrowless bone water. He fell beside the hearth, and they took their share. No one moved to stop them. The castle kitchens, once the beating heart of festivity, now rotted in slow silence. The great roasting spit hung broken, its iron limbs rusted and brittle, like the ribs of a long-dead beast. The ceiling dripped, melted frost running down soot-black beams. Firewood had vanished weeks ago. They burned books now. Furniture. Doors. One lady-in-waiting had offered her dowry chest, its carved lions and lilies fed to the flames like pagan offerings. The smoke stung but brought warmth for an hour. And in this season, an hour was a victory. Lady Isolde stood at the high window of the great hall, fingers wrapped in vinegar-soaked linen. They burned beneath the cloth, raw and stiff. But it kept the frost from devouring them entirely. Below, the courtyard had disappeared beneath snow, its once proud banners buried, its fountains frozen mid-spill. The stables were gone, collapsed under weight and hunger. Nothing stirred but the wind, and the wind knew how to whisper cruel things. The horses had died early. Some by blade. Some by cold. Their meat was bitter with desperation and boiled with pine needles to mask the taste. Her husband had wept as he slit the throat of his favorite grey, then buried the tear beneath his collar and walked away. Nobility had learned, in these past weeks, how easily it could starve. Lord Alaric had not left the solar since the first snowfall. They said he read by talolight, hunched over scrolls, feudal records, tax codes, merchant debts long uncollected. As if salvation were buried somewhere beneath old ink and forgotten names. As if parchment could conjure bread. He had stopped answering her knocks. The steward had vanished soon after, the cheese will he carried tucked beneath his cloak like a newborn. The chaplain froze at the chapel's iron door, one hand outstretched as if knocking on heaven itself. They found him with his mouth open and his eyes rimmed with frost. The retainers were down to 4. One limped. One wept in his sleep. One sharpened blades no one could lift any more. The last watched Isolde with eyes too hollow to name. Her ladies-in-waiting had not all remained. Laura, who once braided Isolde's hair and sang love songs in the baths, had sewn her lips shut with black thread, whispering of sins and serpents until her voice faded. Her blood crusted on the needle that still lay on the floor beside her chair. Marion, youngest and brightest, had gone barefoot into the snow at dusk, her wedding dress billowing behind her like a ghost. They never found her body. Only the veil, caught in a hawthorn bush near the forest edge. The mirror in Isolde's chamber had been covered in linen for days now. Maybe weeks. Time no longer moved in days. Only in deaths. Only in quiet. She refused to look at what remained of her once celebrated face. The cheekbones sharpened by famine. The lips crack. Colorless. Her gown, once embroidered with saffron and silver, now hung from her like a funeral shroud. And yet, she held court. Each morning, she dressed. Brushed what hair she still claimed. Tied the sleeves herself when no one else stirred. Then descended the stairs like a queen, though the stairs were crumbling and the torches long dead. In the dining hall, she sat at the head of the long wooden table, now warped with damp. A single candle lit before her. The same candle, relit each day with shaking fingers. No food. No music. Just her. One servant placed a chipped goblet before her each morning. Empty. Symbolic. She inclined her head in thanks. Nobility, even in rot. Especially in rot. The others, those who still breathed, sat, watched, shivered. None spoke. The walls no longer held sound. Only memory. One day, a child servant, a scullery girl who had not yet lost her curls, collapsed beside the hearth. No one caught her. No one screamed. Isolde had watched as her body lay still, steam rising briefly from her skin before the room turned cold again. Later that night, Isolde dreamed of apples. Red-skinned, firm, cold from the cellar. She held one in her dream, and it warmed in her palm. She bit into it, the crunch echoing like a hymn. Woke with the taste in her mouth and tears on her face. Once, her father had said hunger humbles a woman. He had not lived long enough to see that hunger makes saints, queens, and monsters alike. The bells had not rung in weeks. Yet every morning, Isolde listened. She waited for the wind to change. For the sound of hooves. For the black smoke of distant armies. Anything to prove the world beyond the castle had not vanished into white. But only silence came. Loud and unbroken. One morning, after a night of scraping lichen from the walls for broth, she found a crow at the window. Perched. Unmoving. Its eye followed her as she lit the candle. She did not shoo it. Did not fear it. They were kin, now. Survivors. That day, she did not speak. Just sat, posture straight, as if the court still waited. As if night still dined. As if songs still filled these halls. That night, someone tried to steal from the chapel. Bread crusts left beneath the altar as an offering. A trap. The thief was caught. A boy. 13. One of the kitchen hands. They brought him before her. He shook. She rose from her chair and walked the length of the hall, the candle in her hand casting shadows like ribbons. She looked at him, his ribs sharp, his breath short, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that only the starving truly know. Then she said, "We are not beasts." And placed the candle in his hand. She turned. Returned to her seat. The retainers stared. The boy fled. That night, the candle never flickered. And in the chapel, someone lit a second flame. Dawn crept across the castle with gentler light. And when it touched the leaded glass of the high window, Isolde whispered into the frost, "We endure. Not as queens. Not as ghosts. But as those who refuse to vanish into snow." And far beyond the castle walls, the ice cracked. Not enough to melt. Not yet. But enough to whisper, something stirs. The forest did not sleep. It waited. Even in stillness, it whispered. Through the creak of frost-hardened branches. Through the hush of falling snow. Through the brittle rasp of bark splitting under cold it had known for 1,000 winters. But Byrne no longer flinched at its murmurs. He sat beside the fire he had nursed all night, a sad flame, meager and defiant, barely enough to dry the hem of his cloak. The smoke curled into his hood, stung his eyes, made ghosts of the trees. His hands hovered near the embers, blackened, blistered, palms turned up like a beggar's prayer. He was no longer a blacksmith. His forge had gone cold weeks ago. The anvil, rusted and red with blood. His own, and perhaps others. The village had emptied under plague's breath. Screams in the night, the soft thud of bodies falling, the burn of oil poured over straw when the sick were sealed inside their homes. Byrne had watched his wife claw at the door before she succumbed. He had stood on the other side, hammer in hand, and did not open it. He told himself it was mercy. Now, the hammer served as his pillow. As his altar. Sometimes, he slept with it pressed to his chest like a relic. Sometimes, he raised it to the sky, as if God might remember the sound of iron ringing from his hands and answer. But God had grown quiet. Even the wolves had vanished, driven deeper or devoured by something hungrier. The forest was hollow. Each day he wandered the traps he'd laid near the creek. Each day, empty. No hares. No birds. Just snow. Once, he'd found a raven, one wing torn by a thorn, its body stiff as iron. He'd roasted it without hesitation. It had tasted of smoke and memory. When night came, the cold sharpened. The trees seemed to lean inward, listening. And he, in turn, carved. Not for warmth. But to remember. With the edge of his knife, he etched faces into bark, his sons first, wide-eyed and laughing. Then animals he could no longer catch. Then doors. Always doors. He carved one on every tree around his fire circle. Each the same, a narrow shape, half open, with golden lines flaring from within. He dreamed of it nightly. That door. Sometimes he stood before it, barefoot, the snow melting around him from the heat that poured through its crack. Sometimes his wife stood in the threshold, holding the child, beckoning with eyes that no longer accused. Sometimes he opened it, and found only fire. Byrne did not fear the dreams. It was waking that cut deepest. When the wind was still, he could hear them. Voices. A murmur to the left, laughter behind his shoulder. A child's giggle, impossibly soft beneath the branches. He had run once, chasing the sound, stumbling over roots, slipping through snowbanks. But the voices fled. Always. He spoke to them now. "Show yourselves," he would mutter, teeth chattering. "I've not forgotten your names." Then silence would answer. Until the morning he found footprints. Small. Bare. Human. Pressed into the snow less than 10 paces from his fire. He stared at them a long time, heart thudding not from fear, but from the sudden ache of recognition. He had not seen another soul in weeks. Months, maybe. Time had collapsed into whiteness and hunger. The prints were fresh. Not deep enough for a man. No fur. No boots. Just skin. A child. He circled the clearing twice. Knife in hand. Breath held. But the woods offered no explanation. He should have panicked. Fled. Buried the fire and run. Instead, he built a second fire. Across from his own. Close enough to share warmth. Far enough to offer space. That night, he didn't sleep. He waited. The snow fell steadily, quiet as ash. The trees watched. And Burns stared into the flames, one hand on the hammer, the other clutching the carving knife. He whispered prayers he didn't remember learning, words made from old soot and forged smoke. He prayed to his tools. To the flames. To the door carved in wood. Sometime before dawn, he heard the breath. Not the wind. A breath. Shallow. Careful. He turned slowly. At the edge of the light stood a girl. Wrapped in furs too large for her frame. No shoes. Her feet red, raw. Her eyes locked to his, wide with animal suspicion. She said nothing. He didn't speak either. Just held out a strip of bark he'd softened over the fire. Coated in fat from the raven. A bitter offering. She approached like a deer, tensed, alert, every step hesitant. Took it from his hand without touching him. Sat across from him. Near the second fire. They did not speak. The flame said enough. When morning broke, if it could be called morning, for the sun never truly returned. He woke to find her curled like a fox beside the fire. One hand beneath her chin. The other grasping a carved face from his satchel. His son's face. He said nothing. When she woke, she stared at him with a strange calm. As if they had already known each other in another life. As if the forest had always meant to return her. He offered her water, melted snow in a horn cup. She drank. Shivered. But stayed. That night, she carved beside him. A bird. A flame. A door. And when she slept again, she murmured something. A name. Lyra. He did not ask where she came from. She did not ask who he had been. In the forest, names were sacred. Wounds, more than words. By the third night, she laughed. Just once. At a squirrel that dared the fire's edge. It broke him. He turned his face away, tears frozen before they fell. And still the snow came. But now, the fires did not feel alone. And the dreams came softer. The door still opened, but now, a hand reached back. It was not his wife's. It was small. And warm. The carvings began to change. Less faces. More homes. Fences. Bread. A forge. A future. And though the forest did not speak, though the wolves still circled, and the wind still whispered loss, the flame between them grew. Not wide. But steady. And when the child reached for his hand, curling into his side beneath furs they now shared, Byrne whispered to her, his voice a rusted hinge. We live. And far beyond the trees, buried beneath centuries of cold, something old stirred. Something that remembered the sound of hope. The bell cracked like a bone. It rang once, thin, uncertain, then snapped, its iron tongue falling to the flagstones with a dull, unsanctified thud. No one came to lift it. No one dared. It lay there still, half buried in frost, like a broken promise. Time itself broke with it. In the convent of Saint Illyra, hours once moved with sacred rhythm. Lauds at dawn. Vespers at dusk. The smooth passing of prayers through voices that had learned to rise and fall like breath. But now, silence ruled. The sisters no longer gathered with the sun. They woke only when the cold bit hard enough to pull them from sleep. And they slept only when hunger made consciousness unbearable. Snow rose each day like the tide. It swallowed the herb garden, the courtyard cross, the carved steps that led to the chapel. Only the very tip of the sundial still showed, like a blade piercing up from beneath. The gate was frozen shut. The world beyond, forgotten. Inside, candles grew fewer. The wax melted faster now, their flames desperate, devouring themselves as if afraid of being left behind. Each light lost was a star extinguished in a night that had no sky. Sister Agnes was 17. Perhaps. She no longer trusted the calendar. No feast days had been observed in weeks. No saints commemorated. Just more names added to the dead list, ink freezing in the inkwell before she could finish the cross beside each one. Her hands, wrapped in wool torn from what had once been a burial shroud, shook as she prayed. She murmured the words, not from memory, but from instinct. A rhythm her mouth remembered even when her mind drifted. The psalms tasted like ash now. Like blood. Her habit no longer fit. The sleeves hung from her bones. Her scapular dragged across the stone floor as she walked the corridor to the chapel, a ghost trailing a shadow. Meals came at dusk. If they came at all. A thin broth. Saltless. Made from boiled parchment, sometimes. Or the bitter root Agnes once pulled from the edge of the cloister wall before the snow made it unreachable. They blessed it still. Crossed themselves before the first bite. And closed their eyes, not in reverence, but in shame. No one looked at one another anymore. The abbess had sealed the gates herself when the first villagers died. Then came the pleas. The wailing at dawn. Infants lifted over the gate by trembling arms, left on the stone path like offerings to an absent god. The sisters were forbidden to touch them. And so the bodies froze where they lay, until the snow buried them from view. No one spoke of them. But Agnes remembered each face. In the scriptorium, the sacred books had grown lighter. One page at a time fed the flames. Gold leaf. Illuminated margins. Even the hand of Saint Elred had gone to smoke. The ink turned to heat, the gospel to kindling. It burned fast, but not without resistance, pages curling like hands unwilling to let go. The Virgin's face, once radiant with soft paint and light, had blackened in the chapel's heat. Candle smoke clung to her eyes, giving her the look of one who mourned silently, endlessly. Agnes knelt before her each night. Not to ask for rescue. Not anymore. But to ask to remember, to keep the names, the voices, the warmth of skin before it turned to marble. The elder sisters prayed louder now. Their voices rang through the stone halls with cracked fervor, as if volume could warm them, or conjure food from the cold walls. But beneath their chanting, Agnes began to hear something else. Whispers. Not in Latin. Not in any tongue she had studied. Sometimes it came from the rafters, dry footsteps pacing between beams never meant for feet. Sometimes it came from the cloister, where wind swept snow in strange circles, like dancers frozen mid-turn. Sometimes it came from beneath the chapel stones, where water had once run clear, and now only groaned. At first, she told herself it was madness. Then she stopped calling it anything. It simply was. She began to dream. Not the fevered dreams of cold, nor the guilt-laced visions of lost children. These were stranger. Softer. She dreamed of orchards, golden apples that hummed when bitten. Of music, lutes playing songs no nun would ever learn. Of light, warm, slow, pressing against her skin like summer linen. She told no one. Until the night she thought she heard the music outside her cell. It came faintly, like something half-remembered from childhood. A single string plucked. Then another. A slow tune. Old. Impossible. She rose from her cot, feet bare on the cold stone, and pressed her ear to the wall. Nothing. Then, the wind. Then, silence. And the next morning, the youngest sister was gone. Sister Ellen. Barely 12. Soft-voiced, timid, always first to serve and last to speak. Her cot untouched. Her bowl still full. No note. No noise. Only her shoes, lined with straw, set neatly by the gate. As if she had known where she was going. There were no tracks. Only wind-carved patterns in the snow. Spirals. Circles. Marks that no foot could make. Agnes did not cry. Not in front of the others. She waited until nightfall, when all light had fled. Then she lit a single candle in her cell. Not for warmth. There was none left to draw. Not for prayer. She had forgotten which saints listened. She lit it for memory. And placed Ellen's empty cup beside it. She whispered her name, over and over, until it stopped sounding like a name, and became instead a pulse. A breath. That night, she dreamed of a door. Not the convent gate. A narrow, curved archway, covered in ivy, with a golden handle warm to the touch. And beyond it, music. Not joy. Not salvation. But something that pulsed like blood, and called like hunger. She woke with her fingers wrapped around the air, reaching. The candle had burned low. The shadows had crept closer. And the Virgin's blackened face seemed to look straight at her. Not in judgment. But in understanding. Outside, the wind had changed. It no longer whispered. It knocked. And in the distance, faint as breath, another bell. Not theirs. Not anymore. The candle's flame leaned once, then bowed into darkness. There was no sound. Just the faint crackle of wax surrendering to cold stone, and the breath of 3 souls buried alive beneath the floorboards of a house that no longer stood. Above them, the storm raged on, indifferent and wild. It tore slates from roofs, uprooted trees older than the village itself, and screamed through the empty bones of Eldwire like some ancient curse come home. But in the cellar, there was only silence. Not peace, never peace, but a silence so thick it seemed to press against their ribs. Emmerich held his sister's hand in the dark. Her fingers were too still, too cold, but he dared not move. Dared not speak. Beside him, their mother sat with her back to the wall, arms wrapped around them both, her breath shallow. He could not see her, but he knew her shape, the outline of her against the stone, the way her body trembled not from fear anymore, but from the weight of holding them together. They had been in the cellar for days. Or weeks. Or years. Time was no longer marked by the sun or the bell, but by the stories his mother told, softly, between coughing fits, when her throat still allowed it. She spoke of meadows that rolled like waves. Of bread warm from the oven. Of a tree near the old chapel that bore pears so sweet they could bring tears. She told of summer rain, of markets full of spices and laughter, of a river that ran clear enough to see the silver-bellied fish. Emmerich listened. He listened like it was scripture. Like each word had weight and warmth. Like it could anchor him to something other than frost and rot. The last story she told was of St. Corwin, the barefoot pilgrim who walked across the spine of the moors with nothing but a staff and a song. Wherever he passed, the land bloomed. It was a miracle, she said. The path behind him turned to green, even in winter. Emmerich did not ask why no one had ever seen such a thing in Eldwire. He simply imagined that if St. Corwin came now, he would pass above them on the snow, feet bare against the ice, and leave behind not flowers, but fire. Just enough to light their way back to the world. But the storm did not pass. Each morning brought only more white against the cellar door. More silence from the village above. No birds. No dogs. Not even the caw of crows. Emmerich's father had not returned. He had gone out days ago, wrapped in every scrap of wool they had, boots laced with rope, a rusted knife at his hip and a sack over his shoulder. He said there was a root cellar in the next hamlet. Said he would bring back dried beans. Or at least a lantern. His footprints had vanished within an hour. His voice, the last thing they heard, was not a farewell, but a promise. I'll come back. I always come back. But now, there was only the cold. The scent of mildew and dirt and the faint trace of moss they had tried to boil into broth. Hunger gnawed slow. It no longer ached. It dulled, sank into bone, made the air feel thick. Made thoughts slippery. Emmerich dreamed in fragments now, of color, of warmth, of strange places he'd never seen. Sometimes he thought he smelled bread. Once, he thought he saw light seeping beneath the cellar door. But when he blinked, it was gone. His sister no longer spoke. She slept more than she woke. Or maybe she was only quiet. Her breath came in shallow pulses. Her eyes, when open, seemed to see something he could not. A place just beyond this one. Their mother prayed, but only in whispers. And sometimes not in words. Then, one night, something changed. The storm fell suddenly silent. No wind. No snow against the wood. Just stillness. Emmerich stirred, startled by the absence of noise. His ears rang with it. He pressed a hand against the wall. It was wet. The frost was melting. His mother raised her head. He couldn't see her, but he knew by the way her breath caught that she felt it too. She pressed her fingers to his forehead. They lingered there for a moment, brushing hair from his eyes, tracing the curve of his temple like she was memorizing him. Then she kissed the top of his head, quiet, reverent, and said, "It's time." He didn't know what she meant. But she stood, slowly, carefully, bones creaking beneath the weight of stillness. She lifted the latch on the cellar door. And for the first time in weeks, light came in. Pale. Gray. But light. The storm had passed. Or paused. Snow pressed high on the threshold, but it no longer fell. Beyond, the village was unrecognizable, just shapes beneath the snow, roofs flattened, chimneys crumbled. Smoke nowhere. Life nowhere. But the sky was open. The wind was gone. His mother turned to him and whispered, "You'll follow the river." He blinked. "What about you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she placed a cloth bundle in his hands. Inside, dried roots, a strip of linen, and the smallest piece of salted meat, a gift, perhaps stolen, perhaps spared. She crouched beside his sister. Lifted her gently. Wrapped her in the old fur. Her lips moved in prayer Emmerich couldn't hear. Then, she looked at him. "You walk south until you see trees again," she said. "Keep the river on your left. When you see smoke, you run toward it." He shook his head. "You're coming too." But her eyes said no. Her face, thin and pale and beautiful in the morning light, had the calm of someone who had already walked the road once before. She pressed her daughter into his arms. "She's light," she said. "Like summer wind." And then she kissed them both, once, softly, and turned back toward the cellar, toward the dark. Before he could cry out, the door shut behind them. And the silence returned. Emmerich stood in the snow, sister in his arms, windless sky above. He took one step. Then another. The snow reached his knees. The village didn't watch him go. No one did. But the river called, faint, like a thread pulled through the cold. He followed it. 1 foot. Then the next. And though the world was white, and the trees were far, and the wind had teeth, he carried a voice within him. A story. A saint. And somewhere beyond the frost, a door not yet shut.